Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The United States has done what may have been unthinkable just a number of years ago. It has sanctioned the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif. This is at the same time that other countries, specifically European countries, are trying in some way or the other to salvage the nuclear deal. Now, there's also, of course, this question of Germany not wanting to sign on to the U.S., a plan for security in the Persian Gulf as well. We'll try to touch on all of those topics, but certainly Foreign Minister Zarif being sanctioned is the most significant news when it comes to Iran at this point in time. And it's interesting and ironic, really, that it was the same Foreign Minister of Iran who, a number of years ago, right as the nuclear deal was about to be signed, made this statement, which I want to play right now with subtitles. Let's listen to that.
و پولی اتحادیه اروپا از روز اجرا لغو کل تحریم‌های ایالات متحده در تحریم‌هایی که ایالات متحده اعمال میکنه بر شخصیت‌های غیر آمریکایی از روز اجرای اون متوقف میشه. این همونیه که آقا هم فرمودن چون آمریکا.
All right, well, that statement, just for our guests' sake as well, is the one where Foreign Minister Zarif made in September 2015, saying that all European Union as well as American sanctions would be lifted on Iran. Again, the irony being now in 2019 that Zarif himself now finds himself under U.S. sanctions. Let's discuss all of this a bit further with our panelists. We're now joined by Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who is a foreign policy expert. He's joining us now from the Iranian capital, Tehran. We're also joined by Professor Dr. Juergen Ploehn, who is a political analyst. He teaches political science, especially with respect to foreign and predominantly Western political systems, I should say, at Martin Luther University in Halle. He's joining us now from Germany. And we're also joined by Dr. Sascha Auerbach, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now from the British capital. Juergen, Hamidreza, and Sascha, thank you all for joining us. Juergen, I wanted to start with you, if I may. What do you make of these sanctions on the foreign minister of Iran? What message is the United States trying to send?
Well, the United States want to stress their strong anti-Iranian government stance. They want to stress that they are not willing to accept the nuclear policy of the Iranian.
To you, Sascha, what do you think is the message that the U.S. is sending?
Well, this is part of the maximum pressure strategy that the Trump administration has adopted with regards to Iran. I don't think it's really a winning strategy. It's really going to strengthen the hand of the Revolutionary Guard and not going to have much of an effect on Zarif. I think sanctioning the foreign minister of another country is, in essence, a violation of sovereignty to begin with. So it seems like another impulsive move, which will get headlines but won't have any real concrete result on, except to worsen the relations between the U.S. and Iran.
I wanted to ask you, Juergen, do you think it's good strategy to ever really sanction the foreign minister of any country? Because that seems to then close the door, does it not, on any negotiations?
Indeed. It is a horrible idea. The Iranian foreign minister had studied in the United States. He had presented his country at the United Nations in New York. He has ties to the United States of America. So he could be used as a link, a person who understands American ways of thinking. And he is a first-rate contact person for the U.S. government in Iran. Maybe that he does not make the decisions in foreign policy himself, but he can present the thoughts of other countries to the decision makers, and it is not wise to cut off the contact to such a person.
Okay, so Hamidreza, I wanted to get your thoughts a moment on the domestic political pressures on the Rouhani government and Zarif himself. As I played that clip at the beginning here in the introduction, that's very important context here as well, isn't it? Because those domestic pressures also then play out in how Iran's foreign policies are shaped. Do you think that in some ways there will be many people within Iran who will be looking at Zarif and Rouhani and saying, "We told you so"?
There might be such things, of course, but this has been actually being told since the, let's say, the very beginning of the JCPOA, because from the very beginning, the Americans did not commit to the commitments, actually fulfill the commitments they had. And but what I would expect now with this funny movement by the American politicians is that it would unite actually Iranians more than before. And now everyone from all different parties inside Iran would actually put their supports behind Mr. Zarif, Dr. Zarif. So at such moments, Iranians usually do not seize the moment to criticize the other party. They prefer to actually use the chance as a, let's say, an opportunity for adding to the unity, national unity. But yes, we have had the criticism from the very beginning, but now on, I wouldn't expect that, at least for the short term.
And then, Sascha, that sort of goes against, seemingly at least, the goals of the U.S., doesn't it? Where it would seem to want the Iranian people to almost, carry out an uprising against their own government. They seem to not really have an understanding, do they, Sascha, about how the Iranian nation works, and that's just sort of bad strategy, is it not?
Yes, I think it's characteristic, though, of the rather chaotic and poorly thought out U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration. It really hasn't been effective in any of its initiatives that I can remember, and this is just more of the same. In fact, the maximum pressure strategy is inherently contradictory. An attempt to bring Iranian leaders to the negotiation table while also fomenting internal dissent it's a solution that is destined to backfire.
And so what do you think then the next steps will be at this point? Because, every time we talk about this region and, the talk about the security, set up a committee, otherwise they'll be set up to protect, quote unquote, the Persian Gulf as well on the part of the U.S., which, mind you, Germany has said it will not take a part of or be part of. Do you think that will still go ahead, and how will that then be received in capitals like Tehran and otherwise?
I think we're in a very volatile situation, and it's very difficult to predict what the outcome will be, because we don't know the steps that each side are going to take. On one side, you have a lot of internal tension within the Iranian state, with groups like the Revolutionary Guard acting as kind of a government within the government, but they have limitations on their ability to influence policy. And then on the other hand, you have a U.S. administration, which is divided between a group of hawks like John Bolton, who are actively, I think, seeking a more open conflict with Iran, and a president who is isolationist, who is very unwilling to get involved in a war so close to the election, and who's taking advice from people like Fox News commentators like Tucker Carlson, who are not experts on foreign affairs. I don't think anyone on the U.S. side that is being listened to really has a good grasp of, and you pointed this out yourself, a good grasp of the very complex political situation within Iran right now.
So then, Juergen, do you think that, in fact, this is like where you are in Germany, do you think that Berlin has a better understanding of the Iranian psyche, really, when it comes to how Iranians react when they're under pressure? And do you think that's why Germany has said it will not be part of this U.S. plan for the Persian Gulf?
There are several levels of the conflict. We heard about the different ideas within the United States just a moment ago, and there are also different ideas of acting within the German government. See, we have a coalition government in Germany with the Christian Democrats in the leading position. Angela Merkel belongs to that party, but her foreign minister belongs to the Social Democratic Party, which has a long tradition of abstention. Germans abhor any participation in wars since 1945. And so whenever there is a risk that a conflict might turn into combat action of military, then Germans generally tend to abstain. So this is a general rule of German foreign and defense policy. Okay. In this particular case, there is also the attempt to use persuasion as long as there is any chance, persuasion to turn the Iranian side back to the agreement on their nuclear power, which has been arranged by European as well as U.S. diplomats, and so the Germans want to bring Iran and the U.S. back on that course.
All right.
See, whenever
Juergen, I'm going to cut in just because I do apologize for cutting you off. I'll ask Juergen and Hamidreza to stay on with us. I'm going to say thank you to Sascha for his time. All right, let's add another voice now to this conversation. We're now joined by Rasha Aljoundi, who is a senior researcher at the Orient Research Center. She's a master's graduate from Leicester University in the UK in International Relations and World Order, and she's also a Gulf policy specialist, as well as, of course, her other titles. Also, she's joining us now from Dubai. Rasha, thanks for joining us for this conversation here on Scope. Rasha, what are your thoughts about the sanctions placed on the Iranian foreign minister? And of course, this comes in the context of actually the UAE and Iran coming to some sort of an understanding, don't they, about now security in the Persian Gulf?
For sanctioning Zarif, I think it's the U.S. administration way of declaring that Iran doesn't have a separate political, peaceful side other than the IRGC or the Hezbollah. Aside, Zarif was very effective in trying to convince the world that exists. The U.S. administration believes that Iran has just one body, one ideology, and several channels to manage its goals. Secretary Zarif's role for the Middle East was like Goebbels' role in Germany. If he presents the ideas to the world in appealing, civilized manner, it doesn't mean that the Zarif aim is any different from the IRGC or the whole system that backs terrorist group in the Middle East and the world. Trump, it's actually for the UAE, I don't think that it's kind of understanding. The meeting was scheduled up front in Tehran, and the UAE always had a moderate point of view and position regarding its relation with Iran and any other neighboring country. The UAE was never aggressive in its position.
But then Rasha, it can be argued, can't it, that Zarif was an important moderating voice from Iran, that at least as a foreign minister, it's not smart to be sanctioning any country's foreign minister, really, because that closes the doors on negotiations, doesn't it?
I'm very glad that you raised this point. Actually, Trump, we know that President Trump tried on many occasions to open negotiation channels with Iranian regime, but the Iranian regime refused many times also to negotiate, especially on issues that could undermine Iran's ability to control and spread influence in the Middle East. For example, its missile program. Just less than 30 minutes ago, Iran-backed militia in Yemen, the Houthis, apparently decided to retaliate for sanctioning Zarif by declaring they used long-range missile to hit the Dammam city in Saudi Arabia. Another ballistic missile attack happened in Aden as well today, a city that have been safe for a long time during the conflict. All this clarify why the U.S. or any other country are insisting on organizing military presence, not political or diplomatic channels with Iran, because they are refusing. They are
that's a good point you bring up, the Russia. I apologize for interrupting you, just because we're running out of time, so I'll ensure I get my other two guests in on this as well. Hamidreza, tell us about whether you think Zarif being sanctioned will close essentially the doors for negotiations. Iran has not, as Rasha there said, been prepared to negotiate much with the U.S., has it?
It is actually the United States who is not prepared for negotiation. Iran has been negotiating from the very beginning. Iran has been committed to the JCPOA. Iran has been inside the JCPOA. And the only party, it is the only committing part, actually. The others, the Europeans did not fulfill the commitments at all. The United States has withdrawn from that. And they are just now saying that, okay, we have withdrawn, you must remain in the JCPOA, and then let's get to the table for the negotiations. There is no further negotiation when you have actually left the table. If there is anyone to be prepared, it is the United States. Okay. And yes, they have closed the door, yet Iran is still prepared. It depends on the Americans whether they actually decide to be realistic, decide to be honest in the negotiations, or they just want to say something. They are just, let's say, for example, another example is Secretary Pompeo saying for several times that I'm interested in doing interviews with Iranian media, and they are just rejecting several requests by Iranian media. There is just words by American.
Okay, so let me come in here, and I'm just going to take extra and give Juergen 1 minute. Juergen, I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you think that the countries like Germany and others can salvage the nuclear deal and can try, and can successfully, I should say, tone down tensions in the region?
I think it gets more and more complicated, difficult, and if the U.S. pursues its policy in this way, as we've just seen it with respect to the Iranian foreign minister, the chances are rather dim.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final thought, but of course we appreciate all of our guests for their time and of course their insight. That was Juergen Ploehn speaking to us from Germany. We were also joined by Rasha Aljoundi, Sascha Auerbach, and Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who were all joining us and sharing their thoughts with us. Of course, appreciate their insights. Viewers, this is obviously a complex situation, but in some ways not that complex. The Iranian government had been warned by pretty much everybody, really, that they should have gone into this with more open eyes. But is their role also troubling at this point in time going forward? Have they also played a destabilizing role in the region, A, and B, when it comes to the nuclear deal, by, according to some accounts, of course, not being as willing to negotiate with the Americans in such a scenario. But of course, the context is that the Americans walked away from the nuclear deal first and never really actually implemented it, even under President Obama. It's important to note. We'll keep a close eye on this. What does the sanctioning of Zarif mean? What does Germany refusing to take part in this U.S. plan for the Persian Gulf mean? Is there more of a split now between the EU and U.S. on Iran? All we'll have to wait and see how that works out going forward. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. North Korea has fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles off the east coast. That was according to Seoul, at least. But new reports coming out are saying that, in fact, there's been a rocket system which has been tested by the North Koreans. At least that is the claim on the part of some. But the more important factor of all this is, why would North Korea want to be testing all these weapons at this time? This is a tactic which it has used in the past, especially around the time that the annual military drills take place between the United States and South Korean armies, respectively. On top of all of this, we have the breaking news, or the recent news that has come out about defection across the DMZ on the part of a North Korean as well. Let's talk about all of this in the context, of course, also of those talks that had taken place and that meeting that had taken place between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un right at the DMZ itself. Our guests joining us to discuss this further are Yoichiro Sato, who is a professor at Ritsumiken Asia Pacific Studies Center. He's joining us now from Beppu in Japan. We're also joined by Phill Hynes, who is a political risk and terrorism analyst in Asia. He's the head of political risk and analysis at ISS Risk Limited. He's joining us now from Hong Kong. Phill and Yoichiro, thank you both for joining us. Phill, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What are your thoughts about these recent tests on the part of North Korea? Is this essentially a bargaining tactic on its part?
I would say it's partly a bargaining tactic and partly symbolic, and that the North Koreans are obviously disappointed by the lack of traction in their negotiations with the Americans in the past 12 months or so. Everything seems to have somewhat tapered off since the Singapore summit. We obviously had the collapse of the Hanoi summit, and then a recommencement of sorts of the exercise with South Korea and the US. So it's also probably testing various components or elements of either existing rocket system modifications or new ones as well. They normally do multiple things at one time for various reasons.
But then, Phill, I wonder about the logic, though, of having all these tests at this time, because at least the South Korean government right now, under Moon Jae-in, is one that actually wants peace on the peninsula. So isn't North Korea actually not doing itself any favors in this situation?
Probably not doing themselves favors in terms of an international perspective, but you have to bear in mind that the geopolitical dynamics of Northeast Asia are currently in transition. There are realignments and fractures taking place since January of 2018 to now. The alliances between Japan and South Korea, for example, are quite fractured at the moment. China's benefiting from the division between South Korea and Japan. Japan are also facing a situation where they can't be sure what the next move from the Trump administration is going to be. They're also feeling somewhat sidelined and ostracized from the entire process to date. So what do they gain from it? They're sending fairly resolute messages at the same time.
Okay. All right, so Yoichiro, I wanted to get your thoughts about Japan's role in all this specifically, because Japan has essentially reached out to the North Koreans and said, listen, let's talk without any conditions even. What role do you think Japan is trying to play in all this?
Yes, when President Trump announced that he is planning to meet North Korean leader, Prime Minister Abe, he thought that Japan will have to catch this opportunity in order to bring the abduction issue onto the agenda. Otherwise, there was a risk that Japan's agenda will be left out while Trump and Kim may advance their talks on the nuclear issues.
So then do you think, Yoichiro, that there is actual possibility of the North Koreans wanting to even meet the Japanese?
North Korean side is not very eager to meet the Japanese, but there are some incentives that when nuclear deals, and whether with the abduction issue or without, near some agreement between the U.S. and North Korea, there's a very high likelihood that some form of aid package to North Korea will be part of the deal, and Japan is very much expected to contribute financially to this kind of aid package. And in what form will it be done? Japan has already promised that in return for normalization of the relationship, Japan will provide economic aid package equivalent to sort of wartime reparation for the Japanese colonization of the Korean Peninsula, which the Japanese government already paid to South Korea, not as a reparation, but in the form of the economic assistance.
Yeah.
But North Korea is demanding the modern day equivalent or higher, actually, of such kind of economic assistance from Japan.
Okay, so then Phill, and I'm glad Yoichiro brought this, the issue of aid is certainly an important one when it comes to the North Korean context, isn't it? Because even the most recent reports have come out that food is really running short there in North Korea, and that's obviously been an issue for a very long time. But there are quite some alarming reports coming out now from the country for those organizations that have been able to observe it in some form closely. Do you think that will almost force Kim Jong-un's hand in some ways?
Actually, is it an issue of aid or is it an issue of sanctions? The issue of aid is connected directly to the issue of sanctions. And at the moment, the imposition of the sanctions are having probably the greatest impact on the North Koreans' ability to harvest the food that they require. Currently, up until certainly last year, they were able to produce enough food to feed themselves largely. Okay. There were obviously certain areas that they were experiencing problems in, but their lack of mechanization and fuel, particularly to harvest within the actual harvest window, was one of the fundamental problems they were facing. So the aid is connected to the sanctions, but the sanctions are the problem here, the origins of the problem.
So then why, again, I go back to the point that I asked you earlier, because I'm really trying to see the logic then from the North Korean point of view about all this. Then why test these weapons? How does that help their cause?
Well, you have to understand the psychology of North Korean people, or as a nation. They're very resilient people. Last year, they negotiated. They had a negotiating position, actually, that they intended to ask for a number of very key critical sanctions to be lifted. When they went to Singapore, that's what they asked for. And then it was reported thereafter that they'd asked for all sanctions to be lifted. Yeah. And I was assured, because I was actually in North Korea at that time, during that summit, I was in North Korea. Okay. And I was told then by several government people that they were not asking for all the sanctions to be lifted. They only wanted some of the sanctions lifted. So the build-up we've had from then to now, where they've now started testing short-range missiles or up to medium-range missiles, perhaps, as in the first two. Yeah, that's a response to circumstances.
Okay, so Yoichiro, I want to give you the final word. Do you agree that a lot of these issues when it comes to North Korea are really just about sanctions, as Phill there has correctly said? Because that makes complete sense, doesn't it? That the sanctions are obviously, it's a cause and effect thing, where the sanctions are making it hard then for the harvest, et cetera, and that's why there is the shortage of food within the country. Why not address that first? Do you think that that's what Japan and other countries in the region should be and might be pushing for at this time?
I don't fully agree with what Phill said. I think, first of all, sanction is not targeting the kind of humanitarian needs of North Korea. And secondly, the fuel shortage has been very much eased by illegal flow of fuel and other necessities into North Korea. And the UN is trying to address this issue together with willing coalition partners, but so far it's not been successful. There are a lot of speculation that countries like China and Russia are not very willingly supporting the sanction, and even South Korea to some extent. So the sanction targets the elite class who is very much behind Kim Jong-un's leadership. And if this continues, yes, it does hurt Kim Jong-un's leadership. So he wants sanctions be eased, but he is not willing to make a significant compromise on the nuclear issue. So countries like Japan is very much afraid of losing the financial contribution without anything in return.
Okay, we'll leave there as a final word. And of course, we appreciate Phill for both of their time and of course their insight. And of course, this is a discussion which we've only just really touched the surface of. But it's important because it's all about cause and effect, as I had put to Yoichiro, and as Phill had correctly there described, the sanctions are what leads to the shortage of food and even, as Yoichiro said, fuel within the country also. But then, North Korea is finding ways around it to the extent that it can. But then the argument about sanctions has always been that it is meant to target the elite. That's the same argument that is used for sanctions on Iran, for example. But yet it does affect the people of those respective nations. And then, of course, then there's North Korea's tests of these weapons. The logic being, of course, that North Korea is frustrated at this point in time. And it seems, at least, that it is trying to use these tests as somewhat of a bargaining tactic with the U.S. and other countries in the region. Japan, of course, trying to reach out to North Korea at this time as well. We'll keep a close eye on how that develops there on the Korean Peninsula. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, the Five Eyes intelligence agencies, and those countries in part also include, of course, the UK, the US, Australia, and others. They have called for their spies, as well as their police officers, to be given backdoor access to WhatsApp and other encrypted communications. We can probably talk about Telegram as well, which is essentially a lot similar to WhatsApp. In fact, the GCHQ, the UK's counterintelligence agency, has said that it wants ghost protocols to be used, i.e. for a police officer or intelligence agents to be silently added to all conversations or group chats. And of course, as you can imagine, human rights experts, many security experts, as well as companies and civil society organizations, are opposed to any such talk. On the side of these governments, they're saying that, listen, we need this sort of access to be able to protect people from child abuse, as well as to detect any future possible terrorist attacks as well. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Simon Hale-Ross, who's a senior lecturer in law and policing, the Department of Law and Criminology at Edge Hill University. He's joining us now from the UK. Simon, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on. What do you make, Simon, of this demand by the Five Eyes?
Hi, yes, thank you for having me back. I'm not entirely sure that the demands that you've just suggested are fully accurate. What they've suggested is that they need more targeted powers. And what I mean by that is that if you have a subject of interest, what the intelligence agencies are wanting to do is to be able to basically use a backdoor, side door, however you want to phrase it, a ghost protocol in order to get inside those communications. So it's not the entirety of the United Kingdom or the entirety of the populace of the Five Eyes or the 9 Eyes or the 14 Eyes. That's not what they're suggesting. This would be a targeted power. And but
then, Simon, if I may, just for a moment, isn't that giving all these countries and their intelligence agencies a bit too much? Isn't that too much of an optimistic view of how they may use this? There's certainly a lot of room for abuse of this, isn't there?
I mean, this in a word, no. Perhaps I'm being a little optimistic. I'm not sure, but I know from speaking within my area of expertise, from others such as Lord Carlisle, Lord Anderson, who were previous independent reviewers of UK anti-terrorism legislation. They seem to suggest that we don't have government operatives working for GCHQ, MI5, MI6 or SO15 Counter-Terrorism Command in the United Kingdom, simply sat there twiddling the thumbs, picking letters from the alphabet on who to have a look at next. And to suggest such a thing to them is actually repugnant, and they find it risible. Our security agencies are extraordinarily overworked. We simply don't have the resources to monitor the entire populace. There are in place laws, and agents must act within the law. They have to. So in order for there is a process, and I'll explain it very briefly as best I can for your viewers. The process is this: if I'm a Bobby on the beat, beating around in the internet, if you like, and I see suspected activity happening in WhatsApp or within the internet framework, I would have to then open an investigation onto a certain suspect or a subject of interest and escalate that further. There are internal checks within the agencies, within the managerial processes, for a warrant to be signed off. That warrant, according to the Investigatory Powers Act 2016 in the United Kingdom, then has to be signed off by the Home Secretary, whose decision is then reviewed by the independent judiciary, by an independent judicial commissioner. There's 13 in total, in addition to the actual commissioner himself. So there's a whole process.
And what you're describing, Simon, is a process of checks and balances, and I completely appreciate and understand that. Obviously, that's what's on paper. But then I wonder, even in 2015, Michael Chertoff, the former head of U.S. Homeland Security, in fact warned that building backdoors into these encrypted applications would be a mistake. He said the idea of preventing communication among criminals was a pipe dream, saying, in fact, backdoors or side doors or whatever we want to call them would, in fact, just make ordinary users like yourself and myself less secure online. What do you make of that?
I mean, this is what the tech companies are telling us, and this is we can only go off what the tech companies are saying to us. And what they're suggesting is that any side doors, back doors, front doors would weaken the system. That is a concern. I'm not entirely sure what the agencies are trying to actually achieve by this, because there's already legislation in place, particularly in the UK, that gives our agencies access to WhatsApp communications. The problem is, of course, it takes time. And if time is of the essence, that's when it becomes a problem. And that's when I think they would like to use these powers. So if there's a terrorist incident that's about to happen, this bomb's been planted throughout London, time is of the essence. They need to locate all the individuals, all the subjects of interest very quickly. And it is about that time is of the essence, and I think that's why they're trying to press for some sort of backdoor way in. I'm not entirely sure it's even possible for WhatsApp to create such a thing. It'd be interesting to see.
Simon, Telegram, for example, which is basically just like WhatsApp, has a secret chat mode. And I've used it myself, in fact, as a journalist, sometimes to speak to sources and otherwise. But in fact, even Telegram has been criticized for allowing that, because the terrorist attack that happened in Tehran in Iran not too long ago in the capital, in fact, those terrorists had actually used Telegram and that secret chat mode as well to carry out those attacks. So do you think that there is genuinely a need for all of us who would, at some point in time, the governments would argue, listen, if you have nothing to hide, then what are you afraid of? I'm sure you've heard that argument a number of times before as well. Should we all just accept that, listen, we will not have the level of privacy that we all thought we should have online?
See, this is the difficulty that we have, don't we? I mean, with legitimate I've said this before, with legitimate technological growth comes criminal activity. And criminals are moving more and more online. And when we're talking about here, we're not talking about the local drug dealer at the end of the street knocking out a bit of cannabis. We're talking about serious organised crime here. We're talking about child pornography on an industrial scale. We're talking about human trafficking, sex trafficking and slavery. And even more concerning, to be frank, organ trafficking. I mean, at the moment on the darknet, you can buy a kidney that's been heart, lungs, pancreas, that have been harvested from people whilst they're still alive, forcibly. So there is a serious issue here that we have, and crime is moving online. Unfortunately, I think we've all got to have this inward discussion or inward battle, if you like, of how far are we going to allow the state to intrude on our privacy and our private lives in order to keep not only us safe, but other people safe. And also then is how that information is then used. I mean, in the United Kingdom, we do have and the European Union, there are very strict legislative measures in place. So I'd be tempted to suggest that the security services would not misuse them, although historically we have seen some instances of that, and that's disappointing. But when it comes to targeted individuals, this has got to be treated seriously, the utmost seriousness.
All right, so I'll leave it there for now, as clock has gotten the best of us, Simon. But of course, we appreciate your time and your insight on this important topic. As Simon there was talking about, viewers, we have to contextualize this issue of surveillance online, because we're talking about very serious issues such as sex abuse, child trafficking, human trafficking, organ trafficking, even as he described, that occurs through the dark web, quote unquote, and through secret encrypted communications. Then, of course, the even more serious issue, possibly and arguably, is that of terrorism. How then do we balance keeping everyone safe in the real world, as well as respecting everyone's human right to privacy online through their respective communications also? Because both of those concerns are just as important as the other. Can we simply just say we trust our governments to follow the proper checks and balances, or do we all need to be convinced a bit more about the fact that our privacies will be respected online? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope, but I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.